Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming back to the Love and Betrayal channel. Today, I have a new and quite interesting story to share with you, The Silence After Goodbye. The funeral was quiet, too quiet for someone like Daniel. The man who used to fill every room with laughter, with grand stories and silly impressions, was now just a framed photo next to a casket. I stood there, frozen in my black dress, my hands clenched together until my knuckles turned white. People murmured around me, offering condolences, touching my shoulder gently like I might break apart. But I already had. He died 3 days ago in a car accident. The police said it was sudden, quick. He didn't suffer. I didn't cry, not at first. I was too numb, too shocked to feel. Then, on the day we buried him, something strange happened. Max, our dog, refused to leave his grave. He was a German shepherd, strong and loyal. Daniel picked him out 2 years ago, said he needed a protector for when he went on business trips. But Max ended up choosing me. He followed me everywhere, slept by my feet, knew when I was sad before I even said a word. And now, as they lowered Daniel into the earth, Max let out a low whimper and laid down beside the grave, ears down, eyes still, like he understood death in a way even I didn't. I tried calling him. Max, I said softly, then louder. Come here, boy, let's go home. But he didn't move. He just stayed there, head resting on the grass, silent, still. That night, I came back after everyone had gone. The cemetery was cold, lit only by the orange glow of a distant street lamp. Max was still there, in the same position. I knelt beside him, ran my hand along his fur. You have to come home, buddy. You can't sleep here. He didn't respond, just let out a small breath and looked at me with eyes I couldn't read. I sat beside him for an hour, too. The moon rose higher and the breeze grew colder. Eventually, I picked him up gently. He didn't resist and carried him to the car. He was heavier than I remembered, but the next morning he was gone again. I found him back at Daniel's grave. From then on, it became a routine. Every morning I'd find Max curled up there, silent, waiting. Every evening I'd bring him back, and every night he'd slip away again. The groundskeeper at the cemetery started leaving him food and water. People whispered, said it was beautiful, loyal, heartbreaking. I didn't know what it was, but something inside me told me Max knew something I didn't. Weeks passed, and grief started changing shape. The shock faded, the denial, and something darker crept in, not just sadness, but suspicion, because as I began going through Daniel's things, I found pieces of him I didn't recognize, receipts from places we'd never been, photos in his phone of people I didn't know, a second phone hidden in the bottom drawer of his office. I turned it on. There were messages, dozens, between him and a number saved only as C. I scrolled through them, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I miss you already. She suspects nothing. I'll sneak away next weekend like always. You're the only one who really understands me. My hands shook. I couldn't breathe. Daniel and my husband, my best friend, my everything, had been living a double life with someone else. And Max had known. I stared at the dog as he curled up again on the grave, and suddenly something clicked. Max wasn't just mourning. He was waiting for someone. Or something. The next morning, I decided to wait with him. I packed a thermos of coffee, wore a heavy coat, and sat near Daniel's grave, while Max laid beside it like always. Hours passed. Nothing. But then, just after 4 p.m., I saw her. A woman, late 30s, dark hair pulled into a neat bun. Dressed in all black, she carried a single rose. Max lifted his head. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just watched her. She knelt beside the grave and whispered something I couldn't hear. Her hand brushed the cold headstone. And then, without turning to look at me, she whispered, You never told her about me, did you? My blood froze. She knew me. She knew about us. I stood up slowly, heart hammering. Who are you? I asked, my voice shaken. She turned then, her face pale, eyes red. I'm Clara, she said. Daniel's a friend. Friend. A word that felt like poison. Max stood now, moving toward her. Tail wagging just a little, like he knew her, like he remembered her scent. And in that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. Max wasn't sleeping on Daniel's grave because he missed him. He was waiting for her, Clara. Her name echoed in my ears long after she said it. It was soft, familiar, like a shadow that had always been near, but never quite visible. She stood there beside Daniel's grave, and for a brief moment I forgot how to breathe. Friend, I repeated, my voice sounding foreign to myself. Clara tilted her head slightly and gave a sad smile. I suppose that's the word he used with you, too. Max sat between us like a silent bridge, his eyes shifting from her to me, confused. Or maybe not. Maybe he understood this better than both of us. I swallowed hard. How long? She looked away, biting her lip. 3 years. The words hit me like a slap. 3 years. 3 entire years of lies. Of stolen weekends, of late night texts I never saw, of birthdays he said he had to travel for work. And all the while, I thought we were happy. I thought we were building something real. Clara continued, I didn't know about you, not at first. He said you were complicated, that you had grown distant. I almost laughed, bitter, broken. Complicated, we were trying for a baby, going to therapy. He said we were reconnecting. Clara's face fell. I didn't know. I looked at her, really looked at her. She didn't seem like the kind of woman who would knowingly ruin a marriage. But then again, neither did I. I had one what believed love was a solid thing, a foundation, a promise. But standing there looking at the woman my husband had loved while still loving me, or pretending to, I realized love could also be messy, shifting, unfair. I crouched down next to Max and ran my fingers through his fur. He kept coming here, didn't he? I asked. Clara nodded. Even before he died. Sometimes he'd bring Max with him when we met nearby. He said this place calmed him, that he needed quiet away from the noise of everything. Max pressed against me and I felt his heartbeat, strong and steady. How many secrets had he kept? How many scents did he carry home on his fur while I was too blind to notice? I loved him, Clara said quietly. I looked up, stung by the words. But I never meant to hurt you. You did, I whispered, even if you didn't mean to. We stood in silence for a while, two women mourning the same man in different ways. And that night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed we once shared, staring at the empty pillow beside me. Daniel's cologne still clung faintly to the sheets. I hated it. I missed it. I didn't know anymore. I got up and walked to the closet, opened the box I had shoved aside days ago. Inside were the things I hadn't wanted to face. The second phone, the messages, a necklace I'd never seen before, delicate silver with a tiny C engraved on the charm. I held it in my palm. He must have bought it for her. There were receipts too, hotel stays, dinners, plane tickets, all things he had told me were business. He had been meticulous, thoughtful, even in betrayal. I found a note folded in his handwriting. I didn't recognize it at first. It wasn't for me. Clara, I'm sorry. I wish things were simpler, but the truth is, I love you. I don't know how to leave her. Maybe I never will, but you're the part of me that feels free. I crumpled the paper in my fist. So I was the prison? I was the life he wanted to escape? I sank to the floor and let the tears come. The first real ones. They burned as they fell. Max came over and nudged my hand with his nose. Then, without a sound, he laid beside me, just like he did at Daniel's grave. And I realized he wasn't just grieving on Daniel. He was grieving us. The next morning, I made a decision. I called Clara. We met at the same cemetery bench beneath the willow tree near Daniel's grave. She looked surprised to see me. I don't want to fight, I said, holding up a hand. I don't want apologies either. She nodded slowly. I just want to know why from your side. Clara exhaled. He told me he married young, that he never got to live, that you wanted different things. I stared at the headstone. He said you were trying to get pregnant again, but he didn't want another child. That hit me harder than I expected. He said it would trap him, that he felt like a stranger in his own home. I blinked back the sting in my eyes. I had never known he felt that way. I asked him why he stayed, Clara continued. He said he was afraid of losing everything, you, the house, Max, his whole world. But he already lost it, I said, barely above a whisper. She nodded. I think he knew that. When Clara left, she knelt beside Max and kissed the top of his head. And said. Max didn't follow her this time. He stayed beside me. And in that moment, I realized he had made his choice too. Daniel may have loved two women, but Max had only ever loved one. Me, I thought the hardest part would be the funeral. But it wasn't. It was the after, the silence, the echoes in the hallway where his voice used to be. The way Max would still perk up at the sound of keys jingling, then lower his head when he realized no one was coming. It was the way the fridge still had his favorite brand of mustard, the way the closet still smelled like him, the way I still caught myself setting the table for two. That was grief, but it was also betrayal. It lingered like perfume on a scarf I didn't remember wearing. He was gone, but he had left pieces of himself everywhere, and every piece was a lie. I started boxing up his things. Not out of anger, out of necessity. It was the only way I could breathe again. Max sat near the bedroom door, watching me carefully as I folded shirts, sweaters, and pants. But when I reached for the bottom drawer, his private drawer, Max suddenly let out a low growl. I froze. Max? He stood up slowly, ears back, body tense. It wasn't an aggressive growl, it was a warning. I pulled the drawer open anyway. Inside was an old shoebox duct taped shut. My fingers trembled as I peeled the tape away. Inside, I found letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Clara. Some dated back years, some unopened, some stained with what looked like tears. There were printed photos, too, him and Clara, laughing at a beach, holding hands at what looked like a vineyard, one where he kissed her forehead while Max sat between them, tongue out, tail wagging. That broke me more than anything. Max had known her, been with them, lived two lives just like Daniel had. I didn't know what to do with the box. I wanted to burn it, tear it apart, mail it to Clara with a note that said, "Here's your fairy tale." But I didn't. I kept it, because deep down, I needed to understand the man I had married, even if that meant confronting every piece he left behind. The next morning, I received a call from someone named Eleanor. She said she was Daniel's attorney. "I'm sorry to call under such circumstances," she said gently, "but there are matters that need to be handled. Regarding his will." My chest tightened. Daniel had a will? He never told me. I met her the next day at her office, numb, cautious. Eleanor was a tidy woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice. "There's something you need to see," she said, sliding over a sealed envelope. Daniel's handwriting stared back at me. I opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry, not for leaving, but for not having the courage to say what needed to be said while I was still here. I loved you, Eliza, I truly did, but somewhere along the way, I got lost. I wanted more. I thought I deserved more. I thought love would forgive me for needing freedom. Clara wasn't about replacing you. She was about escaping myself." Max, he knows, he always knew. He never judged me, never turned away. Please take care of him. And one more thing, the cottage by the lake, it's yours. I bought it for you. I never told you because I thought I'd surprise you on our 10th anniversary. I just never made it that far. I didn't know whether to scream or sob. He had planned a life with me while living another with someone else. I folded the letter, placed it back into the envelope, and stared at Eleanor. She gave me a soft smile. "He left everything to you, including the cottage." I nodded numbly. That weekend, I drove to the lake house. Max rode in the passenger seat, head out the window, eyes calm. The cottage was beautiful. Wooden, tucked between tall trees, the lake sparkled like something out of a postcard. There was a porch swing, wind chimes, a hammock still tied between two old pines. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. Max jumped out before I opened the door. He ran to the edge of the dock, then stopped, tail still. He stared at the water, unmoving. When I followed him, I found something strange. A small journal tucked under the hammock, weathered by time but dry, hidden, protected. It was Daniel's handwriting again. Inside were pages, no sketches and memories, but one entry stood out. "She'll never know about Clara, but Max might. He always waits for her after I leave, every time. I wonder if dogs can love two people at once, or if he's just pretending for me." My stomach turned. So he knew. He knew Max would go back to Clara when he wasn't home. He knew he was living in the middle. He even questioned if Max loved him, or just tolerated him. And now Max was still grieving, not because he missed Daniel, but because he had lost the man he tried so hard to understand. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch, Max by my feet, staring into the dark stillness of the lake. Did he love her more? I asked aloud. Max didn't move. Or did he just love who he was when he was with her? A breeze stirred the chimes. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. He gave Clara his heart, but he left me to his ghost. And maybe that was worse. Because ghosts don't leave, they linger, they haunt. The cottage was meant to be a gift, a surprise, a promise. But standing there, surrounded by pine trees and echoes of a life that never fully belonged to me, I realized it was never truly ours. Maybe it never was. It was his escape, his secret, and perhaps his apology in wood and stone. The air was colder that night, and yet I didn't light a fire. I wanted to feel the chill. I needed it, to stay awake, to stay grounded, to keep the storm inside from consuming me. Max slept curled beside the hearth, his breathing steady. Sometimes I wondered if he saw Daniel in his dreams, if he barked in sleep, not because he chased rabbits, but memories. I hadn't touched the journal again. I couldn't. Not yet. The next morning, I explored the cottage more carefully. Every drawer, every cabinet. The kitchen was stocked. The closets had clothing in Daniel's size, brand new, tags still on. There were books on the shelves I'd never seen him read, a guitar in the corner I didn't know he played. This place, it was his version of himself, the man who read philosophy, who cooked with fresh herbs, who sang maybe when no one was listening. Who was he here? And who was I supposed to be in this fantasy? I opened a drawer beside the bed and found an envelope addressed to Clara. Again, always Clara. Inside was a birthday card, never sent, handwritten, neat. I wish I could give you this in person. I wish this place was for us, but it's too late. I've made my choices. I'm sorry I dragged you into my confusion. Like this cottage was supposed to be the life I never lived. Maybe in another world you would have sat on this porch with me every morning. I stood there trembling. So even this, the place he claimed was for me, had been, at least for a moment, imagined with her. The betrayal was no longer sharp. It was dull now, like a bruise that had settled beneath the skin, but it hurt more because it was everywhere. It lived in the walls, in the books, in the echo of a life he built between us and her. I stayed at the cottage for 3 more days, not to mourn him, but to cleanse him. I opened every window. I washed every sheet. I lit candles, not in grief, but as if I were exercising his memory. I walked barefoot on the dock, whispered my pain into the lake, let the wind carry the weight of questions I'd never have answers to. And Max changed it. He no longer curled up by the door waiting. He stayed near me, watched me, protected me, as if he'd finally chosen which ghost to follow. On the 4th day, I returned to the city. I left the cottage behind. I didn't sell it. I didn't burn it down. I left it as it was, a monument to the man who tried to live 2 lives and failed both. Back home, everything felt smaller, colder, quieter, but strangely, it also felt mine again. I started over, not in grand gestures, in small things. I repainted the living room. I made snads. I donated Daniel's clothes. I put up new pictures, ones of me and Max on walks, sunsets, flowers blooming from cracks in the pavement. I let life come back slowly. I let silence breathe instead of haunt. One afternoon, months later, Clara reached out again. She wanted to meet. I hesitated, but I said yes. We met at a small cafe, no graveyard between us this time, no shadows. She looked different, tired, but softer. I've decided to move, she said. A new job, new city. I needed to tell you. I nodded. I found his journal, I said. She looked down. So did I, the one he gave me years ago. We didn't need to say more. The truth was already laid bare between us. 2 women, once enemies by accident, now just survivors of the same storm. Before we parted, I asked her one thing. Did he ever say he regretted it? She paused, and said, yes, I saw it, then answered carefully. No, but sometimes when he talked about you, he looked like a man who had lost something he didn't know how to name. I nodded, and that was enough. That night, I dreamt of the cottage, but Daniel wasn't there. Max and I were, sitting on the porch, watching the lake. The wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel haunted. I felt free. He gave Clara his heart. He gave me his ghost. But in the end, I was the one who survived him. And Max? Max chose me. He always had. Even when I didn't know I needed him. The days blurred after Clara left. Not in the numbing, hollow way they used to, no longer haunted by echoes of Daniel's voice or the ache of unanswered questions. This blur was gentler, like the sun rising behind a thin curtain, still fragile, but warmer than before. I found myself reaching for new routines. Morning walks with Max, grocery lists with only my preferences, books Daniel would have never touched, and silences that no longer needed filling. But healing is never linear. Grief doesn't knock once and leave. It lingers in forgotten places and smells and dates and a half-remembered melody he used to hum while brushing his teeth. It was a rainy Sunday when it hit me again. I was folding laundry. Max was curled up on the rug, head tucked beneath his paw. That's when I found it. A shirt, one of Daniel's, stuffed deep in the back of the closet I thought I'd emptied months ago. It was soft, worn. I held it against my chest before I even realized what I was doing. And then I cried. Not the angry, broken sobs of betrayal, not the breathless weeping of grief, but the quiet tears of remembering someone who once meant the world, before I knew the rest. Because even if he had betrayed me, there was still a time when he was mine. And that time was real, and I missed it. I missed her, the version of me who believed in him, who trusted the future, and him, the version of Daniel before the secrets. Even ghosts deserve their space, I realized, but they don't deserve to rule your heart forever. The next day, I visited the lake cottage again, not to mourn, to reclaim. Max bounded ahead of me as I unlocked the door. He darted to the dock, tail wagging wildly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment too. The cottage was exactly as I left it, but it felt different. I brought paint this time, curtains, a new blanket with sunflowers stitched into the fabric. I removed the photo of Daniel and Clara I'd found tucked in a drawer and replaced it with one of me and Max, taken just last week, sunlight in both our eyes. This was no longer his ghost house. It was my healing place now. That evening, I walked the shoreline barefoot. The water lapped softly at my toes. The journal Daniel had left still sat on the bedside table, untouched. I finally picked it up and read the last entry. If she ever reads this, I hope she forgives me, not for what I did, but for not being honest enough to let her go when I knew I should have. I loved her, I truly did, but I loved my fear more. And Max, he loved her the whole time. I closed the journal gently, and I didn't cry. I simply whispered, I know. Then I set the journal into the fireplace and lit a match. Not out of hatred, but out of release. The pages curled, turned to ash. The past burned, but this time it didn't burn me. Weeks turned into months. Max grew older, slower, but still loyal, still present. Sometimes I caught him staring at the porch, as if waiting for someone who no longer arrived, and sometimes I joined him just to sit, not to speak. Until one day, he didn't get up. He lay curled in his favorite corner, the light of the sunset brushing over his fur like a final blessing. I held him in my arms. I'm okay now, I whispered, brushing his ear. You don't have to stay just for me. He closed his eyes. And I swear, he smiled. I buried him beside the lake, under the willow tree, next to where he used to wait for someone who broke both our hearts. Only this time, he was the one being waited for, by every part of me that had healed because of him. That night, I sat alone on the porch, a mug of tea in my hand. No Max at my feet, no Daniel in my thoughts. Just me, the woman who had been cheated on, lied to, forgotten, but also the woman who had survived, who had rebuilt, who had learned that sometimes love doesn't come in grand gestures or perfect vows. Sometimes it comes with four legs and quiet eyes that never leave you, even after goodbye. And when the heart remembers what the mind tries to forget, you don't have to fight it. You just let it pass through, like a wave. And then you begin again. I never thought a mailbox could hold so much meaning. It was just metal and wood, hinges rusted from rain, a tiny red flag that no longer stood straight. But for years it had read, Daniel and Eliza Marshall. In block letters, I had stenciled myself on a spring afternoon the year we bought the house. It had felt real back then, permanent, like carving our names into the world together. But now, every time I checked the mail, those letters stared back at me like a dare, as if asking, how long are you going to keep pretending he's still here? I ignored it for months. Let the rust gather, let the mailman slip envelopes in without looking twice. But grief, I learned, is like mold. It spreads in the places you pretend not to see, until one day I couldn't unsee it anymore. It was a Tuesday. Bright, clear, the kind of sky that used to make Daniel want to take spontaneous road trips. I stood on the porch with a paint scraper in my hand. Max was gone. The silence of his absence still pressed against the edges of my chest, but it no longer consumed me. It had become a companion, a quiet reminder of everything we had survived together. I stared at the nameplate, and then I scraped it off, letter by letter. Flicks of paint and dust floated down onto the dry grass like bits of memory being shed. I didn't cry. Not even when the final piece, his last name, peeled off in one smooth strip. I stood back. For the first time in a long time, the mailbox was blank. Not because I had lost someone, but because I was finally ready to reclaim what was mine. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store. Bought new stencils. Just one name this time. Eliza Piet. No last name. No title. Just I painted it on slowly, carefully, letter by letter, stroke by stroke. And when I finished, I stepped back and looked at it, not with pride, but with peace. This was the woman who had survived everything. The betrayal, the lies, the death, the silence, and still stood. A few days later, a letter arrived. No name on the envelope, just my address in soft, curving handwriting. Inside was a photograph of Max, lying under the willow tree by the lake. It had been taken by someone else, probably a visitor to the area who had seen him there and felt moved enough to snap a picture. On the back, scribbled in faint pencil, were the words, "He waited so quietly. I thought you'd want this memory." I did. I held the photo to my chest and whispered, "Thank you." Then I placed it in a frame and set it on the mantel, right where our wedding photo used to be. Some nights that I still heard them, ghosts. Not Daniel's, not even Max's, but mine. The version of me who once believed in forever, who forgave too easily, who waited too long for someone to become who he promised to be. I sat with her sometimes, let her cry, let her speak, and then I reminded her of the woman we had become, the one who wasn't waiting anymore, the one who had learned that love doesn't always look like vows and flowers and cottages by lakes. Sometimes it looks like walking your dog through grief, or repainting your mailbox in silence, or saying goodbye without burning everything down. I took one final trip to the cemetery before winter. The headstone hadn't changed, just his name, just the dates. I brought flowers, sunflowers, Max's favorite to sniff. I knelt and whispered, "You were a chapter, not the whole book." And that was was the last thing I ever said to Daniel Marshall. Months passed. I wrote more. I smiled more. I even laughed without feeling guilty. And one morning, as I opened the mailbox, I found a letter, not for him, but for me, addressed to Eliza, no other name needed. Inside was an invitation from Clara, a new city, a new life, a gallery opening of her photography. She had included one picture in the envelope. Max, under the lake's willow tree again, but this time with me sitting beside him. Neither of us looking at the camera, both of us looking forward. And suddenly I understood. Love doesn't always return the way we expect. Sometimes it comes back through a picture, or a painted name, or a silence that no longer hurts. And in those small, almost invisible ways, you are reborn. It started with the letter from Clara, the invitation to her gallery. At first, I left it on the kitchen counter, untouched for 3 days. I wasn't sure that what unsettled me more, the idea of seeing her again, or the idea of stepping into a part of her world that Daniel once shared. But something about that photo she sent, Max and I, under the willow, held a quiet power. It wasn't just a picture. It was a memory from the version of life I never got to live. The peaceful life, the healed one. So I packed a bag and drove 5 hours to a city I'd never called home. The gallery was tucked into a narrow street, warm light glowing from the windows like a heartbeat. Inside, it smelled of wood, old books, and something faintly floral. Clara was there, standing beside a photograph of a train station, smiling gently at each guest like she belonged to this world now. She saw me almost instantly. There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, then gratitude. She walked toward me, not as the woman who once loved my husband, but as the one who helped bury him too. "Eliza," she said, her voice soft. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "And neither was I replied. We stood there in silence, the kind that didn't demand words. She gestured toward the far wall. "There's something I want you to see." It was a corner display, simple, almost hidden. A series of photographs titled, "The Life We Didn't Live." The first image was a lake at dusk, still water, no people. Then a porch swing, a cup of coffee left steaming on the railing. Then a dog's paw print in the dirt, trailing toward the woods. And then me. Or rather, a blurry side shot of me sitting under the willow tree. Max beside me. Neither of us looking at the camera. "I took that," Clara said, "last autumn, from across the lake. I didn't know if I should keep it, but when I developed it, I realized something." "What?" I whispered. "You looked free." I turned to her. "You looked like someone who finally belonged to herself." Later that evening, I walked through the city alone. Lights glimmered above the street like stars trying to be brave. And as I passed a small vintage bookstore, something caught my eye in the window. A leather-bound journal. The exact shade of Max's fur. I walked in, bought it without thinking, and wrote on the first page that night in my hotel room, "This is for the life I'm living now. Not the one I lost, not the one that was stolen, not the one I imagined, but the one I chose, the one that begins again with only me." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The act of writing it was the signature. When I returned home, the mailbox still had my name, just Eliza. But the house didn't feel as empty anymore. I opened the windows. I let the light in. I started writing in the journal every morning, just a few lines. Sometimes a memory, sometimes a question, sometimes just gratitude. It became a ritual, a way of keeping Max close, Daniel distant, and me present. One day, while reorganizing old boxes, I found a folder I didn't remember packing. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by me. To Daniel, letters I never sent, apologies I never voiced, angers I never admitted. The first one was dated the night we lost our first baby. The handwriting was messy, the ink smudged by tears. I don't know how to talk to you anymore, so I'm writing. I want to believe we'll be okay, but you've gone quiet, and I'm scared. I'm scared you're leaving, even though your body is still here. I flipped through them, one after another. A decade of unsaid pain. A map of every fork in the road where I stayed silent. I sat on the floor, surrounded by my own ghost words, and smiled sadly. These weren't letters to him, I whispered. They were letters to myself. That night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. I burned each letter slowly, not as revenge, as release. And for everyone that turned to ash, I wrote a new line in the journal. This pain will not define me. Love, even when broken, taught me how to feel. He left, but I stayed, and that matters. I don't dream of Daniel anymore, not in the way I used to. Now, when he appears, he's quiet. He doesn't speak. He just watches. And I think even he knows I am no longer his story to haunt. On the last page of the journal, I wrote, "To the version of me who waited, who forgave, who broke and mended, you are not gone. You are still here, and you are enough." I closed the book, not because the story was over, but because mine had just begun. The sky was painted in soft hues of peach and lavender the day I returned to the lake. The wind was gentle, like fingers brushing through memories. It had been a year since Daniel's death, a year since I discovered who he really was, a year since Max left my side under the fading light. And still, this place remembered. The dock creaked just as it had. The porch swing swayed as if someone invisible had just left. And the willow tree stood tall, quiet, faithful, just like Max had. I walked slowly toward it, barefoot in the grass, the earth cool beneath my steps. The sun was low, casting gold across the water. And there it was, a small, weathered stone nestled in the roots of the willow. Max, you waited, and I saw you. I knelt and touched it gently. A single sunflower had grown beside it, bent unexpected, just like our bond. I sat there, leaning against the trunk, the breeze lifting strands of my hair. No tears came. Only warmth, only peace, because in this place I had lost everything. And yet I had found myself. I took out the journal, the one I had started after Clara's gallery. It was almost full now. But I had saved one last page. I wrote slowly, carefully. To the man who broke me, thank you for teaching me how to rebuild. Not to the woman I was, I forgive you for staying too long. To the dog who stayed, you saved me. And to the life I thought was over, thank you for continuing. I signed it this time. Eliza. No last name, no husband attached, just me. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows on the water. Birds called in the trees. And somewhere deep in the woods, a howl echoed. Not a cry of sorrow. A call. Free whole, I smiled. Then I stood up and began to walk back toward the cottage. But not as the widow, not as the betrayed, not even as the woman who once waited beside a grave. I walked as the woman who had outlived her ghosts, who had buried her pain, who had sat in the dark and still found her own light. Before I left, I turned back to the willow one last time, and I whispered into the wind, I'm not coming back to grieve anymore. Then I smiled, and neither are you. In the end, it wasn't Daniel who shaped my story. It wasn't Clara. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was Max, a dog who never left, who waited through the storm, who slept on a grave not because he mourned a man, but because he waited for the one who needed him most. Me? Sometimes healing comes softly, in walks by the lake, in paint scraped off a mailbox, in letters you never send, in paws that press into your chest at 3 a.m., in wild sunflowers you never planted. And sometimes the greatest love story isn't the one with grand gestures or perfect endings. It's the one that teaches you how to come home to yourself. The wind picked up as I stepped onto the porch. And a net and heart. And for the first time in a long time, I opened the door to a future that was fully, finally mine.